I'm Taylor. I'm a co-founder of Watershed. And I'm excited to talk today about corporate climate action that matters. Now, at Watershed, we build software to help companies decarbonize. And we're working with companies like Airbnb and DoorDash, Stripe and Square, Sweetgreen and Everlane, and many others to help them cut their carbon emissions and do it fast. And today I want to talk about how companies can do that work well. Now, this is Climate Week. There's a lot of talk this week, a lot of pledges and commitments and glossy headlines. And there's more talk this week than ever before. Something's happening. Every company is thinking about climate for the first time. But the reality is, it's not enough, not even close. Most company pledges don't amount to anything. And if everyone jumping into the climate fight does it the old way, we're in trouble. So today I want to talk about the how companies can take action that goes beyond talk, that actually keeps carbon out of the atmosphere, how they can take action that matters. And I think the inescapable fact of climate change in 2021 is that we have vanishingly little time. I want to start with this graph, global emissions per year. Year after year, they've marched up. And we're now at north of 50 gigatons of CO2 belched into the atmosphere every year. Now, if we did nothing, emissions would continue to balloon, and the world warms by 4 degrees centigrade by the end of 2100. This is almost unimaginable what we'd leave to our kids. The good news is we are doing something. Governments are setting policy, the world is decarbonizing, and so current policies are bringing us on a path where emissions flatline. And temperatures rise by more than 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. But this is still a world we don't want for ourselves or for our kids. And so we need this third path of cutting carbon emissions in half by 2030, getting to zero by 2050. This is the task. Climate is a math problem. It's all about bending the curve from the yellow line to the blue line. The problem is we have very little time. We have 10 years to cut emissions in half. And a decade may seem like a long time, but if you think about that decade starting at the beginning of 2021 and going to the end of 2030, every month is 1% of the time we have left. Every day is 2.8 basis points of the time we have left to solve climate change. So when someone reschedules a meeting on me by a month, in my head I'm thinking that's 1% of all the time we have left to solve climate change. So I think the question we all wrestle with is, what can we do? What can our organizations do that make every day count? And that's a question that I've been wrestling with personally since I was 13, when I saw Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, and I walked out of that movie theater scared and angry and pretty riled up to try to figure out how to do something. I went home and I tried to guess Al Gore's email address. And someone wrote back from info@algore.com. And they said that they were training a couple hundred people in Nashville, Tennessee, to give their own versions of the Inconvenient Truth slideshow. But that they weren't sure if a 13-year-old could actually rent a hotel room. So I convinced my mom to fly me out to Nashville, and I spent all of high school skipping class to give this talk, this kind of customized Inconvenient Truth talk about climate at schools and communities and libraries. But I always struggled with this question. If climate is a math problem, if the only thing that matters is that carbon graph, how could my actions actually prevent carbon from going into the atmosphere? The talks were nice, but they were just talk. And so after college, I went to work at Stripe, payments technology company in San Francisco. And that's where I realized that it's organizations, and especially companies, that hold the leverage on this problem. They are on the front lines of that carbon graph. They make the decisions every day about how to transport goods, about how to generate electricity, about how to produce food. And so the carbon in the atmosphere is really the sum total of all of those decisions that businesses make every day. And so we started Watershed back in 2019 with the goal of changing those choices. to enable companies to choose a zero-carbon future, not in the abstract, but in the decisions they make on energy, on transportation, on procurement, on manufacturing, and food every single day. And a couple years later, companies like Airbnb and DoorDash, Sweetgreen and Everlane, and the powerhouses of the internet like ServiceNow, Shopify, and Stripe are using our software to measure their emissions, to chart a plan for reducing carbon, to fund carbon removal, to buy clean power, to report on their progress. And we're just getting started, but the companies that use Watershed already manage more than 10 million tons of CO2 per year, more than double the carbon footprint of the city of San Francisco. And as we've worked with them, we've seen that they're taking a new approach on corporate climate action. And I want to share that approach with you today. It starts with this recognition that the time for press releases has passed. We've had 20 years of companies declaring good intentions, declaring to be carbon neutral, publishing glossy sustainability reports once a year. And let me tell you, that does not cut it. Because year after year, emissions are marching up, the planet's getting warmer. We've been having companies publish their carbon graph, but they're not actually bending it. Right now, we're in the midst of this stampede of companies starting to think about climate for the first time. But if they take this old approach, all we're going to have to show for it is another 20 years of press releases. So we don't need more participation. We actually need companies to shift how they're taking climate action from an old model to a new model. And I think there are 4 ways that this new model of climate action is different. First, companies need to shift the goal. They need to shift the objective from this narrow objective around accounting and disclosure and checking the box to a new imperative to basically ask, how can we as an organization use our leverage to make net zero happen for the world faster? Second, they need to shift what they measure from just looking at the 4 walls of the corporate office, the light bulbs and the waste bins, to looking broadly at every step of the value chain. And they need to shift what they do from just offsetting a small chunk of emissions to kind of a combination of deep reductions and permanent carbon removal for every ton of CO2 that they touch. And more fundamentally, we need this mindset shift from thinking of climate as something that's bolted on, published in a sustainability report PDF once a year, to something that companies are actually embedding in how they operate, and how they design their products, and how they compensate their executives. So this is what we need to do. The details matter here. And I want to talk about each of these 4 areas and how companies are writing a new playbook. It starts with what you measure. In the old approach, companies look narrowly at what they directly control. The electricity, the natural gas, the vehicles you own, the buildings you operate, what the carbon accountants call Scope 1 and 2 emissions. Now, these are the easy emissions, but for most companies, they're not actually where the carbon is. The carbon is in this next circle, in Scope 3, in the whole kind of carbon ecosystem that companies are a part of, suppliers and customers, transportation, investments. Every ton of carbon that goes into a company's products, into producing and moving and using that product, is your carbon. And it's not just physical goods. Services take carbon too. And for most companies in the economy, 80% of the carbon is in this ring. We're also seeing the emergence of another concentric circle, a kind of sphere of influence of carbon that doesn't show up anywhere on a company's carbon balance sheet, but is influenced by their decisions. Now, for too long, most companies have ignored these outer rings because they're hard to measure. They're hard to wrap your heads around. How can you even grok what carbon it takes to produce the computers that you buy, to produce the food that goes on your menu? But at Watershed, we're working with a set of companies that are leaning into this, are thinking deeply about their whole carbon picture, and they're finding that there's more they can do than they initially thought. Square, which produces payments hardware that powers a lot of the economy, is tracing carbon all the way back to their electronic suppliers in China. Shopify was one of the first companies to switch to remote work during the COVID pandemic. And they asked this question: what is the impact of a remote workplace on our carbon footprint? At first, it seemed kind of like a no-brainer. Less commute, less offices, less carbon. But there are all these interesting questions. What happens if someone moves from a city to a suburb and buys a car and stops commuting by the subway because they can work from anywhere? So Shopify is surveying all of its employees on their remote working habits to get an accurate picture of the true carbon cost of this new hybrid workplace. Sweetgreen is measuring the carbon of its salads all the way back to the farm, to questions around what fertilizer is being used, what is being done with manure on farms and dairies and creameries. And DoorDash is looking at the impact of all the drivers, all the vehicles, all the restaurants in their whole food ecosystem. Now, these data problems are intimidating. They're a lot harder than just looking at electricity and estimating your scope 1 and 2 emissions, but they are tractable if companies use software to measure carbon in the way they use software to measure the rest of their business. And the whole point here is not just to get the numbers better. It's not about better measurement. The point is about better action. Because once companies see their whole carbon picture, they can actually do something about it. So, what to do? This is the old world. Look at a small subset of your emissions, maybe your electricity, maybe commute, maybe business travel, and buy a carbon offset. Basically, pay someone else, somewhere else, not to pollute. Publish a report, call yourself carbon neutral, you're done. Now, there's two problems with this. Number one, you're ignoring most of the emissions of your supply chain. Number two, the carbon's still going in the atmosphere. You may have accomplished some accounting notion of carbon neutrality, but that's about it. Now, the reality is this approach is what is sitting behind most carbon neutral press releases for the last 20 years. So we need to do better. And I think we're seeing the emergence of a new world, this kind of net zero world, where companies start by taking responsibility for all the emissions they touch. And they do everything possible to reduce those emissions. That means they're looking outside of their walls. They're pressuring suppliers. They're redesigning products. They're redesigning their operations. And they're doing that on par with what the science demands of the whole economy. Now, how far to cut is a really complicated question, and it's awesome that the Science Based Target Initiative and other groups are kind of sketching out what is good enough on this front. And then once companies have cut their emissions as deeply as they can, they fund kind of permanent carbon removal for whatever emissions remain. And this is different than a traditional offset. Instead of just paying someone else not to pollute, they're actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it underground. And the magic of this new approach is that if every company on Earth and every industry in the economy did this, we would have a net zero world. That's the litmus test. If every company took this approach, what would happen to the world's carbon graph? So these are the two approaches. And I think the key question right now is, as every new company is thinking about climate, which approach are they going to take? And it may seem like carbon neutral and net zero are the same. When you look at the press releases, it's hard to tell the difference, but the details really matter here. Now, the good news is that a bunch of companies are showing that this is possible. And so I want to talk about a few of the companies that have been kind of paving this path over the last decade. About a decade ago, Google realized they had a problem. The data centers that power our searches and our YouTube videos and our email were becoming some of the world's largest consumers of electricity. But Google decided to match every megawatt of electricity with a new megawatt of zero carbon power on the grid. Hundreds of companies have followed suit, and this corporate demand has been a huge force in lowering the cost of clean electricity for the whole economy. Now, Google's not stopping there. Because the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine, there's still natural gas and coal required to keep data centers powered. And so they've set a new goal of adding enough storage and firm clean power to actually match every minute of their electricity consumption with clean power somewhere on the grid. And I think what's really powerful about the Google approach is that they looked beyond just the simplest way to zero out their own emissions. It would have been much easier for them to buy clean power in a way that kind of enabled them to declare carbon neutrality. But they thought through, what would it take for us as a company to not just change our own power bills, but to decarbonize the whole grid? And they're lowering the cost of clean power, which make it easier for other people to deploy it. And that kind of kickstarts this green vortex, this virtuous loop of decarbonization for the whole economy. Another example of flexing power is Apple. Apple took apart their iPhones and their iMacs, and they figured out that a lot of the carbon was coming from an aluminum, which has traditionally been smelted using coal power. And they've been thinking about, their engineers and their suppliers have been working for years on low carbon ways to produce the aluminum that go in those devices, with hydro, with recycled aluminum, and now with new chemical processes that may be zero carbon from the beginning. What's really neat about Apple is, like Google, they've tried to make this available to the whole industry. They publish a report every year of all of their suppliers that have committed to use clean power so that any company can source supplies from those companies. Another example of leverage is Walmart, which sells a pretty meaningful percentage of all of the physical products in the world. And their suppliers care an awful lot about what Walmart thinks about them. So for the last decade, Walmart has been using that leverage to introduce their suppliers to climate, to start them on measuring emissions, on setting targets. And a couple years in, Walmart suppliers have collectively avoided hundreds of millions of tons of CO2. Now, this isn't just for the world's biggest companies. It isn't just for Google, Apple, and Walmart. At Watershed, we're working with companies of all industries, of all shapes, of all sizes to push the envelope. Sweetgreen's a restaurant chain. They've got north of 100 stores in the US, and they're thinking about how to redesign the food system at every step of the way to be zero carbon. When they design new menu items, they count carbon alongside calories and cost. And when they go to source ingredients for those menu items, they actually ask farmers about their practices, about whether or not they're using methane digesters to process manure, about how much fertilizer they're consuming. They're redesigning their buildings to be zero carbon from the beginning. And through all of these steps, they're aiming to build a zero carbon food system within Sweetgreen, not by 2050, but by 2027. Now, Stripe and Shopify are taking a really interesting approach on trying to drive a different type of technology down the learning curve. They sit quietly at the middle of the whole internet economy, and they've decided to redirect some of those dollars towards new carbon removal technologies. Now, by the middle of the century, we're going to need tens of gigatons and hundreds of billions of dollars of carbon removal if we're going to get to true net zero. Right now, there's a lot of good ideas about how to do that, from giant fans to kelp. But these technologies need customers. They need demand. They need dollars to scale down the learning curve. And Stripe and Shopify have basically decided to be the customers of first resort, the first purchasers of these new technologies. And they've spawned kind of overnight a whole industry of scientists and technologists who are thinking about new ways to develop carbon removal technologies and scale them. And I think as companies think about what to do with their budgets allocated to carbon, directing money towards these types of technologies can have a lot more catalytic impact than some of the traditional carbon offsets. Now, it's not enough for companies to stop there, even at the outer reaches of their own supply chain. Ultimately, we need policy. We need governments to change the rules to decarbonize the economy. We need leaders from City Hall to the White House to wake up every day thinking about decarbonization. And companies matter on this. Too many companies have walked the walk in their own operations, but been quiet when governments are making the key decisions about the global economy. And so we need companies to stand up and to get into the messiness of policy, to get into the messiness of politics, to get the rules changed. And right now, today, is a really key time on this. We've got crucial climate legislation hanging by a thread in Congress. We've got the COP meeting in 45 days in Glasgow. And companies need to show up in those rooms to use their megaphone to say, yes, decarbonization is possible. We've done it in our own business. And now we need governments to encode it for the whole economy. So this new model of climate action is possible. And we are lucky to work with a whole set of companies, from food to electronics to technology, that are proving it. They've got these ambitious goals, but more importantly, they have plans, they have teams, they have budgets, they have boards and executives who are holding them accountable. They've got dashboards to measure their progress on climate in the same way they measure their progress all across the rest of their company. So, The how matters, the details matter about how companies jump in to the climate fight. And the good news is that companies can take action in a way that bends the global carbon graph. They can measure everything they touch, they can drive deep reductions and permanent removal, they can embed all of that deeply into the way they do business, so climate isn't an afterthought. They can start with the goal of net zero for the world, not just a narrow accounting exercise. And if every company takes that approach, we have a shot, just maybe, of averting the worst on climate change. But I'll leave you with this. We are running out of time. Every month is a percent. Every day is 2.8 basis points of the time we have left. We got to make it count. Thank you. And we've got some extra time, so I'm happy to do question and answers or discussion if people want to get into the details. Yes? Yes? Yeah, so I think the question was, share an example of how we work with a company, what data we're measuring, how that flows to their operations. We think about it in 3 steps. Step 1 is measurement, step 2 is reduction, step 3 is reporting. On the measurement side, we basically collect raw data about the kind of core of business operations. And that looks different for different types of companies. For Sweetgreen, it means that we collect raw data on all the food they're purchasing, who they're purchasing it from, the suppliers and the locations. For a tech company, we collect data on their cloud bill and what instances they're using in what regions. For an electronics company, we collect the bill of materials of what's actually going into that hardware product. And then behind the scenes, Watershed kind of converts every bit of business activity, whether it's a kilowatt hour of electricity or a certain hour of AWS time, into a carbon number. And we've got this carbon database on the back end to power that math. And at the end of that, you kind of get this dashboard of what is my carbon footprint, where does it come from, how does it compare to other companies. And that sets up the really important part, which is coming up with a reduction plan. And companies will use Watershed to figure out, hey, where can we reduce emissions, by how much, how does it add up to what level of reduction over the next decade. And then companies actually get to work, and they can use Watershed to buy clean power as part of that plan. They can use Watershed to fund carbon removal. There's a lot of work around supplier engagement. How do you enable Sweetgreen to talk to the dairy, to talk to the creamery, to actually encourage them to change their practices year in and year out? And that is the hard work every day, every week, every month of actually turning those plans into different purchase decisions, different product designs, different clean power for buildings. And then ultimately, companies use Watershed to share that progress, both internally and externally, on how they're doing. Yes?
Taylor, when do you think consumers are going to get more carbon savvy? Companies are really carbon savvy. They understand what carbon footprint is, at least a small percentage of people. But when are we going to see more things like carbon labels on Sweetgreen salad or Everlane, pair of pants? When is that coming?
Yeah, so when are consumers going to get with the picture? I think it's going to happen pretty fast. And the reason I think that is that in Europe, it's already happening. So we work with a bunch of customers in Europe. And the big difference between our American customers and our European customers is that the companies in Europe are thinking about this very much from a marketing and customer acquisition perspective. It's true if they're a software company, it's true if they're an apparel company, it's true if they're a fintech or a banking app. They see that the way to win customers in 2021 is to have credibility around their climate plans and the kind of carbon impact of their products. So I think generally the US has been a couple years behind Europe on carbon disclosure requirements and that sort of thing. What I'm seeing there makes me think it's going to be pretty mainstream pretty fast. I think the big question on the consumer side is, how do we make sure that consumer pressure points in the direction of the stuff that actually matters? Because a lot of what consumers think is environmentally sustainable is maybe good, but doesn't really matter. If you're talking to a food business, there's a lot of attention on packaging. Is it compostable packaging? But what the packaging is matters a heck of a lot less than what is being packaged. The difference between a chicken burrito and a beef burrito matters way more than what's the foil that goes around the burrito. And so I think that the big question as we shift into consumer demand pushing climate action is, will consumers be pressuring companies to actually do the right thing? Or will we end up with all these kind of feel-good things that don't actually move the numbers? Yes?
What's the process for beginning a Scope 3 accounting or an assessment? Could you just give a little detail about that? And then do you use mostly modeling data for that aspect of assessing the footprint?
Yeah, so on the Scope 3 side, it generally starts with getting the raw purchase data from a company. So the expenses, the capital investments from whatever the source of truth is where that, where those purchases are tracked. And then the Watershed software converts every single line item of a purchase into a carbon number. Now, how that math gets done differs by category, differs by company, differs by product. Where we really need to get to as a whole industry is supplier-specific, product-specific numbers, so that the way you reduce your emissions is not just to buy less, it's to buy different. And we're able to do that for a decent chunk of companies' emissions because companies are reporting more on carbon, there's more carbon labeling out there today, and companies can actually use Watershed to collect data from suppliers, even if the suppliers haven't published publicly. But we're not there yet. We are early. We are in early innings of the kind of carbon transparency movement for companies, and so there are times when we fall back to industry average or modeling data. But I think the whole space needs to kind of walk this journey from industry averages that don't actually enable you to do anything to specific data that enables the right action. Yes?
I had a question in relation to the old model versus the new model. Don't you think the old model is still relevant and important? Because with more action in that space, just by people seeing that a lot, it's going to direct a lot more investment towards that.
Yeah, I think it's important that companies start somewhere, for sure. Some action is better than no action. And I think it's good that we've walked that road over the last 10 years because we've learned a lot about what is possible. We've kind of developed this whole scaffolding of accounting terms and standards and expectations that wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have companies doing something for the last 10 years. But we're just totally out of time. And I think the amount of time that it takes to produce a glossy sustainability report, the amount of time it takes to get an organization to ship a carbon neutral press release, we don't have the cycle time for companies to realize that that doesn't matter. And I think it is such a special moment right now where there's this whole stampede of organizations thinking about climate for the first time that we just can't afford to have all of that potential energy pointed in the wrong direction. And I think this is the sort of critical moment where we need to tell companies, it's not just that you can kind of get a participation trophy by showing up and doing something on climate. The how matters, the details matter, the specifics of the plan and the graphs really matter. Yes?
What do you think is missing in the ecosystem of things that Watershed would wish other companies would go build and help support them with?
Yeah, what a great question. I think two things. I think that the two big unsolved problems on this new decarbonization model are supplier engagement and carbon removal. And on the carbon removal side, we just need more shots on goal. We need more attempts at ways to remove carbon that are eventually going to be cost effective, but now $1,000 a ton, $2,000 a ton, we need more attempts. And I think that's part of why what Stripe and Shopify and Microsoft and a bunch of Watershed customers are doing is really powerful. On the supplier engagement side, I do think there's a need for better standards. Right now there's a lot of spreadsheets being traded back and forth between companies. It's turning into a pretty major paperwork exercise. And yeah, we need a better set of standards about what a company can expect from its suppliers on carbon so that there's a common language there. Because ultimately, so much of corporate decarbonization boils down to, can you engage suppliers to reduce emissions? and can we point dollars towards carbon removal? And so those are the two ecosystems that really need some new energy. Yes?
Yes, I'm very aware of Watershed. My name is Christopher Vicciola. Mr. Taylor, I want to ask your data that you have with Watershed. Are you able to use that to convince lawmakers, politicians to come on board and support the climate movement, again, to decrease carbon and so forth?
It's an awesome idea. And I think, in particular, the thing that we have seen that is so powerful is that decarbonization is possible and affordable. And I think that's a really powerful message for lawmakers to hear. We've started by sharing a bunch of the data that we can share on things like remote work. We've got this calculator online that enables any company to think through, how is my new mode of working going to affect climate? But it's an awesome idea to do more on kind of telling that story to lawmakers and policymakers. I mean, it's a pretty exciting message that if we decarbonize the economy, not only will we solve climate change, but everything else will be better. Our products will be better, our businesses will be more profitable, companies will be more efficient, consumers will be happier. And so I think that is the big message that companies can share with policymakers, is that this isn't some scary price we have to pay. Yes?
Yeah, and I would actually add on to that, city governments spend a lot of money, state governments spend a lot of money, New York being one of them, right? So to whatever extent you can actually use data or sell your service to local government agencies who also have a ton of climate action plans and have infrastructure services that emit carbon,
Yep.
I think that would be super powerful as well.
Yeah, totally. Yes?
Removal technologies. So how do you think we can incentivize the private sector to invest more in carbon removal, specifically technologies like direct air capture, which are incredibly expensive, and because political momentum is focusing on reduction, how can we incentivize the private sector to see the use of that in the long term?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think a lot of it comes down to there being a broader realization that these two different models of climate action are different. I think right now, companies that go the road of funding catalytic permanent carbon removal don't really get a benefit in folks' eyes, because the kind of difference between net zero and carbon neutral is not something that's like really clicked for consumers or different audiences. And so it's pretty tempting for companies to say, I'm just going to go the cheap route of getting to carbon neutrality because that's more compelling. It's easier to put on a bumper sticker than we're funding this next generation technology that's going to pay off someday. And so I think we really need this broader recognition that the new model of climate action, this kind of net zero approach that prioritizes permanent removal, is different and better and more in line with decarbonization than the kind of old cheap offsets model. Until that happens, it's going to be tough for kind of carbon removal funding to really cross the chasm and go mainstream. And so yeah, I think we need to kind of get everyone to wrap their eyes around the fact that not every carbon neutral or net zero claim is the same, and what you're doing to get to zero makes a big difference. All right, yes, maybe one last question.
I had a question around when you are onboarding a new company to work with Watershed, do you present to them a business case that's specific to their needs and the costs that they would be looking at, the savings they would be looking at? Like, what kind of presentation do you have for a new company?
Yeah, I think that one of the really exciting things that has changed in the last year is that, I think a year ago, a lot of our conversations with companies were trying to sell them on the idea of climate action. Now, most companies come in the door pretty convinced that climate action is something that they need to do because investors are demanding it, they're expecting regulators to demand it, employees are demanding it, consumers are demanding it, and their question is how. And that's why I think the details of how really matter, but the kind of the business case for climate action, the expectation that this is going to be just a part of how you do business in the next decade, I think that has really gone from being kind of a niche thing that only the leaders were thinking about to every CFO, every board, every leadership team of a major company in America and Europe, this is something they're thinking about. It's good news, and we got to make sure that it turns into the right type of action. Okay, thank you all very much. It's awesome to be here. See you all.